ACE Podcast.
And welcome back to Vaguely Accurate, and thank you very much for joining us to another episode. Today we'll be meeting Bronwyn Milkins. She is a PhD candidate from the University of Western Australia studying cognitive psychology. She is also a huge mental health advocate, and because we had so much to discuss, we're doing something a little different about this episode. We're going to be breaking it down into two individual installments. The first episode will be focusing on Bronwyn's research and cognitive psychology in the field of psychology itself. The second episode will be discussing a lot more about mental health and learning about Bronwyn's story. I hope you can join us for both of them, and as always, it's great to have your feedback. If you want to get in contact with Bronwyn, I'll be putting her contact details and Twitter handle in the description for the episode, and you can also find it on our website. She has a blog that's also worth checking out. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
No problem.
Really great to have you here.
Yes.
Could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you study?
Sure. So my name is Bronwyn Milkins. I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Psychology in the Centre for Research and Emotion at the University of Western Australia. I'm also a speaker on mental health and other topics relating to mental health in the community, at schools, anybody who will listen pretty much.
So before we get into that mental health stuff, which is really fascinating in itself, what made you or motivated you into psychology?
I've been studying psychology since I was 14 years old, and that's because they offered it at my high school. Oh, okay. And so I really enjoyed doing that. It was really fascinating to me, and I wanted to continue that when I started university. I was also playing music at the time, so I really loved playing saxophone was my main instrument. So I started a degree at uni with music as well as science psychology. And then I dropped the music component because I really just love focusing on the psychology, and then I decided to do music on the side. And it was just absolutely fascinating. We had lectures on neuropsychology and cognitive psychology, and I loved learning about all the different things. And especially the research side of it really captured me, because without research, I'm like, it's just things we think, but the research is actually experiments that we can do to actually say this is what is happening, this is the process or the mechanism by which it's happening. Yeah,
that's really, like, psychology in itself is to me, it's always one of those fields that I don't know a lot about.
Yeah.
But whenever you hear something about it, it's always really fascinating and interesting. I suppose it's psychology is, correct me if I'm wrong, it's defined as the science of human behaviour, human mentality, I suppose.
Yeah, I'd say the science of what makes us tick. So it's thoughts, thinking, behaviour, social dynamics, also perception and faces, and how we perceive and interpret and remember anything in the world around us and relate to each other and relate to ourselves. So it's the science of humans.
With that in mind, could you give us an example of any psychological studies or psychology-based evidence science that has had a significant impact on society, social or individuals within the world, I suppose? Are there any results from research that have made a significant impact?
There are so many. In my own field, I study cognitive psychology, which is how we interpret information in our environment. So I'm particularly focused on attention in my research, what we attend to, how we interpret that, and how that affects our emotions and our behaviour. And one major research study in my area is the fact that introspection is quite unreliable. So when we ask people, how good are you at paying attention to something, they're quite bad at telling you. So which is why we need to use these kind of quasi-objective tasks to be able to infer how good are people at paying attention, what are they paying attention to. Sometimes we use eye tracking. I use these experimental tasks in my research to identify what people pay attention to. But if you ask somebody, they're so bad at it.
So you're going to be subconsciously analysing me here and making sure I'm paying attention. Brilliant.
Yeah, totally. But people are bad at introspection. In broader psychology, say social psychology, there are experiments, especially the Milgram experiment. Was that? I'm trying to remember, sorry.
That's right.
There was the Stanford prison experiment, which is a major one, and that looked at dynamics of leadership. So what they did was they assigned people randomly to either be prison officers or prisoners in kind of a mock prison.
Okay.
And then they watched the social dynamics emerge over power and dominance over the next few days.
Interesting.
So this was in, I think, the 70s. And they actually had to cut the experiment short because what happened is that the people who were assigned to be prison officers internalized their role so well that they were humiliating the prisoners, the participants, and it got into very unethical territory.
How long was the experiment before it got caught?
I think it was supposed to be 7 days and they cut it out after only...
Only took 7 days for someone to be, I suppose, immersed.
Yeah, immersed in their role. And since then, the psychologist involved in that experiment has gone on to lecture about evil, and he was a person who was consulted about the Abu Ghraib tortures, which happened in the US. So he was saying how one bad person might not be, the bad apple on the barrel. It might be the dynamics that create this social shift and create evil.
Taking a bit of a segue, could you give us a little bit of information about this grave thing you've just mentioned?
So Abu Ghraib is G-R-A-I-B.
Oh, great.
I-B. Yeah, and, I can't really remember that well. All I remember is that in the US they had... no, actually I don't remember. I'd have to look it up.
That's fine.
Social psychology is like...
With psychology itself, some people declare it as more of a soft science. Some people declare it as, say it's got components of hard science. When there is an experimental component to psychology, is it often subjective? Is it often qualitative? Or can you get a quantitative output from psychological experiments without going into a neuroscience field?
Yeah. With the psychology, is it a science thing? I kind of don't think that question is important anymore. I mean, I wrote an essay on it in my honours year and I was dealing with that quite heavily. And then I just thought both quantitative and qualitative have their places in psychology. And with humans, it's not like physics or chemistry where you have this solution and then there's the equation to solve that or the perfect solution for what you're looking at. Humans are inherently variable, and I guess psychology is trying to reduce those individual differences to try and get at what is the core element we are examining and how can that be used to explain behaviour or emotions in humans. And so in some psychology experiments, you actually want to exploit those individual differences, and that's where you use qualitative measures. So you might interview people or create focus groups, and they're really important in being able to establish themselves the quantitative measures. So I might establish a focus group of people who have dementia, and that would help me develop a scale to quantify the degree to which they experience dementia and the impact that it has on their lives. So both are very important. And I think like any field as well, it depends on the researcher. So even in physics, you can have bad researchers who don't do what they're supposed to do. It's the same in psychology. You can have researchers who say that our measure tells us about X when it doesn't at all. And their interpretation is completely faulty.
Skewing data. Same thing.
So you can have p-hacking, you can have lack of reproducibility, you can have all sorts of things. And that's inherent in all sciences.
Oh, incredibly so.
Yeah.
I think I'll probably get some hate mail from this one, but I think the strongest evidence for homeopathy is it's kind of a lie from the initial guy, and he ended up getting reprimanded and absolutely scrutinised for making it up because they couldn't reproduce. I suppose all science is defined by is the experiment itself reproduced, not whether it's a quantitative, qualitative, soft, hard, whatever. If it provides new knowledge or human knowledge, then it's going to be, I suppose, a science.
And with psychology as well, I think last year was when a huge study came out that was looking at reproducibility in psychology, and it found that especially experiments in social psychology weren't reproducible. But I think the field of psychology took that news really well, actually, and we've tried to develop new ways to make our studies more reproducible. We've really looked at what we're doing, and there is actually organisations set up to help us create better design experiments and get the outcomes that we're seeking. And I think we don't just sit back and we're like, oh yeah, we're doing a good job. We're actually quite critical of each other, and we're trying to say, no, what you're saying isn't what is actually happening in the world, and we need to redesign our hypotheses. We need to identify the constructs that we're measuring. And So I think psychology is a science. It is definitely a science. We use the scientific method. I don't sit and think about, well, what do I think? And I think I'll measure that. It's definitely very experimental for me, and I love thinking about those things, and it's what makes it exciting for me to do that. And I think I've actually tutored in statistics for undergraduate students for a number of years, and it's actually my favourite subject to tutor because I tell the students, this is how we know things. Like I can't just say this X equals Y or that we have this theory. We know that this theory is supported because of the experiments that we've conducted.
Really cool. Taking a bit of a segue, before we move into your PhD and what you're studying now, you said you took an honours.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about what you studied there, how you came into it?
So in my honours year, that was just after I finished my science degree majoring in psychology, and I did a few other majors in linguistics and anthropology as well. And I was keen to do honours. We had a number of topics that were available to us, and the one that was about sleep particularly resonated with me. I'd actually interviewed people with sleep disorders a few years beforehand in a local hospital, and I really saw the effect that a lack of sleep had on their lives. I'm one of those annoying people who gets up in the morning and I'm really excited to start the day and I'm really cheery and you really hate me in the morning. So I've never had a sleep problem. So when I saw people who had a sleep problem and the huge impact it had on their lives, I was really like, wow, how do we fix this? How do we help these people get more sleep? So my honours thesis combined sleep, cognitive psychology and emotion. It's actually, my PhD now is an extension of what I did in my honours year.
Okay.
So I conducted an intervention study looking at whether retraining people's attention away from negative information that they automatically attend to just before bed lessens their worry and improves sleep.
So, kind of similar to what most people, I'm sure, have read or seen somewhere. It's like take away yourself from social media or light intense screens, anything that's going to really create a sense of attention or concentration and maybe, like you said, disturb you in some way or even just distract you. Like keep your mind chugging through thoughts just before sleep. And they always say, it's like an hour before bed or something like that.
Yeah, it depends on who you talk to and which study you read. So one of my supervisors, she's like, any blue light before bed will disrupt the onset of melatonin, which is a sleep-producing hormone. But I've just read other studies that say about an hour. But generally, if you could just wind down and not have anything an hour beforehand, you'd be ideal. There's a few other studies in other faculties that look at that. So in psychology, I particularly looked at people who have insomnia. And insomnia is an interesting sleep condition because it's both physiologically and psychologically based. So people most often have a stressful situation in their life, and everybody who has a stressor in their life will probably find it difficult to sleep the night before a huge event. Whether they want to or not, they'll be like, I'm going to sleep perfectly, and then they might stay awake for a few hours. For most people, after that stressful event goes away, they'll jump straight back into their normal sleep routine. But there's a particular subset of people who will just find that they're still stressed out and their body is just in this heightened state of arousal. So that whether they've got heightened cortisol or other kind of features which make them stressed out. And what's interesting to me as a psychological researcher is what's going on in their head and how that exacerbates the physiological problem. Okay. So what happens with insomnia is that a physiological problem becomes a psychological one. They wake up in the morning and they think that they've had a really bad night of sleep. But we actually know that when you get people who have insomnia in the lab and we measure their sleep objectively, they've had a perfect night of sleep. They'll still wake up and tell you, I slept badly.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
I've only ever heard it from people with insomnia or, TV. You only ever see, you assume they've tossed and turned, they've not slept well, they've been restless, they've been disturbed. No. But they've actually had a relatively good night's sleep.
Yeah, and so people with insomnia are known to have a misperception of their sleep. So they'll also underestimate the time they spent asleep and they will overestimate the time taken to fall asleep. So once again, if you get them in a lab and objectively measure their sleep, they might say that they took 15 minutes to fall asleep. But you ask them and they'll say it took me over an hour.
That's really odd. It's like a complete skewed perception of your own sleep pattern.
Yeah, so this kind of misperception in people's sleep, where they think they've slept poorly, actually exacerbates their sleep problems. They're like, I've slept poorly. Then during the day, they'll look for signs that they are that they have slept poorly. So they'll be like, I can't pay attention right now because I've slept poorly. And why can't I fix my sleep problem? So at night, they carry these thoughts into it and they're like, my mind can't stop racing. Why can't I sleep? Why am I such a failure? And that exacerbates the sleep problem.
Before I ask the next question, I want to ask, is this the case for all or most insomniacs, or more of a select group? Like, you've got sub-disciplines of insomnia, so is this a select discipline?
Well, actually, that's kind of the future of psychology in a way, because we're thinking that there are particular phenotypes of insomniacs. So the phenotype I would be describing for this case is psychophysiological insomnia.
Yep.
So, that's a pretty apt name.
Pretty self-explanatory. Getting creative.
So there's other types of insomniacs. So there's idiopathic insomnia. So that's insomnia which we have no known cause for. And some people just say, I just can't sleep. And then there's a few other subtypes as well. So there's sleep onset insomnia, where people find it difficult to fall asleep. But then there's maintenance insomnia, where people find it difficult to stay asleep. And early morning insomnia, where people just wake up at 2 a.m., say, when they wanted to wake up at 6.
And just like all the phenotypes, assume the causes for all these phenotypes would be very different in
That's
itself.
What we think.
Like yours is, you're looking into the fact that it could be more of a psychological feedback, whereas others, it could be a chemical feedback. It could be, I suppose, an emotional would still be a psychological one, but a combination, I suppose.
Yeah.
Or, I don't know.
Yeah.
Others.
No, it's definitely true, but I guess the thing with this line of research, and I've got a review article by a researcher called Colin Espy, and he's a huge researcher in insomnia, and he's from the UK. And he says that we actually need more research into the cognitive processes that underlie insomnia, because we don't know exactly how they work and how they cause insomnia. It's actually an area which we are completely at a loss for, and it's only really starting. I mean, you can see over there, I've got Principles and Practices of Sleep Medicine. That's my pretty much summarizes all the research in sleep. But there's heaps of models, like there's a Drosophila model, which is, fly, looking at how sleep from flies could inform us about insomnia. And there's lots of different theoretical models about it. Do you
happen to know how many people, I suppose, as a population average, suffer from insomnia?
Yeah.
Is it a chronic condition as well, or is it something that people might have for a short period in their life if untreated, and it might just dissipate, I suppose?
Yeah, so we know that about 60% of adults will complain of poor sleep, at some point in their lives. About 10% of the population live with chronic insomnia, so that's about 3 months or more to actually be diagnosed with that. And a few other criteria. So it has to have an impact on their day functioning as well. So it's a 24-hour disorder rather than only being confined to nighttime. It has to affect their performance during the day. And we know that the majority of people who experience insomnia do not seek treatment, even though we've got a few good treatments available for it. So they often suffer in silence. So we know that insomnia and even minor sleep deprivation can lead to increased risk of mental illness, mostly depression and anxiety, also increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So sleep is an incredibly important function, which we often underestimate the importance of. It's just as important as eating or drinking. And, we often hear people say sleep is for the weak, or Margaret Thatcher only had 4 hours of sleep and I can do it too. It's not true.
It's not true. There was on the subphylums of one. I had a sleep scientist on the show recently.
Oh, cool.
And we came up with a post-apocalyptic or a pre-apocalyptic scenario. leading derived from his sleep science field. And we found out that there's an insomnia type called fatal familial insomnia.
Oh, yes.
Which just sounds absolutely horrific.
Yeah, it is. It would be. Yeah, I think there's been a few known cases of people to die because they just can't fall asleep, and it's familial, so it's genetic in these families, and it just sounds absolutely horrendous.
It sounds absolutely,
genetically linked, and wow, yeah.
You mentioned that there are treatments available.
Yeah.
How easily accessible are these treatments, and intensive is another thing, and what are they? Could you give us outlines?
So for insomnia specifically, that is tied to the process I just described before of people's emotions and I guess dysfunctional beliefs about their sleep affecting their sleep subsequently, the best treatment that we have is called cognitive behavioural therapy for insomnia. So cognitive behavioural therapy, I guess, is the mainstay of psychological therapies. It's the most well-supported therapy. And what that serves to do is reduce people's distorted cognitions that they have about themselves and how they are in the world. So a person with depression or anxiety, for example, might catastrophize, and that means that they might have a social event coming up and it's with friends, but they may think that it's going to be terrible and everybody's going to think I'm silly and catastrophize about that. So cognitive behavioural therapy helps them see that, well, how about you just go to the party? Let's take a few notes and see whether your beliefs match up with reality. And people often find that the cognitive component combined with behavioural component reduces their beliefs, the severity of their beliefs about how they are as a person. Good. So it's similar with sleep. So it's a combination. There are a few components of it. One is sleep hygiene. So we tell them what's good sleep practices. So it might be turning off the screens an hour before. It might be no naps during the day for them because we need them to feel tired at night. And then it's also reducing those dysfunctional beliefs. So we might actually get them in the lab and then point out to them that you've actually fallen asleep in only 10 minutes. Or you've slept for 8 hours and you actually slept quite well. So we might show them the objective data compared to their subjective to reduce that belief.
I suppose, and if they see that what they is almost a manifestation of their own psychology, they might start to just be a bit more open to being able to sleep or just believe in themselves that, I can do this. I can sleep. So it's almost like reducing a self-confidence thing in themselves.
Yeah, we also tell them what's normal for sleep. So people who have insomnia often have the belief that I need to sleep throughout the night, but it's actually common for people to wake up a few times and then just go back to sleep straight away.
So. It increases as you get older. It's like 2 times a night, the average person or something like that.
Yeah, but they think, oh no, I have to sleep exactly for 8 hours and I have to be in bed, but it's actually not a big deal. Yeah. So we help them to understand that. And so cognitive behavioural therapy for insomnia generally can go for about 8 sessions. You go to a doctor and then you tell them about your sleep problems. You ask them to be referred to better access to mental health care plan, which can allow you to receive 10 Medicare subsidised sessions. And that will help you pay for those treatments. You only pay the gap. So for some people, they're very accessible if they have the financial means to pay for that gap, but for other people, they're not. And a lot of people don't seek treatment for insomnia because they're not aware of this treatment, that it exists.
Yeah.
And then they might not have the financial means, so there might not be a qualified psychologist in their area actually able to deliver this very specific type of therapy. Yeah.
One question I do have, it's a bit more of a, I suppose, futuristic subjective question. I've been looking into recently, yesterday, the use of virtual reality in psychological therapy and psychological research.
Yeah.
Do you happen to have any insight into whether that's going to be helpful for insomnia?
Yeah, not for insomnia, but interestingly, I had an interesting PhD journey because I actually started on a different topic and then changed topics completely 9 months into my PhD.
So what's the title of your previous to your new one?
Yeah, so when I first started my PhD, I was looking at obsessive-compulsive disorder and I was really interested in, and I still am, I was interested in why, say, somebody who has a compulsion to wash their hands but know it's not helpful, why they can't stop themselves from physically acting out that behaviour. And I was really interested in that. And when I was doing research in the first 9 months of my PhD looking at that, I did find a lot of virtual reality stuff. And people were giving people who had obsessive-compulsive disorder virtual reality and asking them to walk through the house and go up to bath sinks. This is for a person who might be phobic of germs. Go up to bath sinks or toilets and just take a look around and put their hand on the toilet and kind of exposure therapy, but in virtual reality. And I actually found it was quite helpful for people who had those kind of phobic reactions to germs or wanted to wash their hands or any other harmful compulsions.
It seems to be, from all the research I've looked at as well, the virtual reality or e-therapy has got a good niche for anyone with a severe anxiety or a phobia where they can start increasing the intensity and the detail of the scenario. And really ease them into it?
Yeah, because for anxiety, a lot of people might think that avoiding the situation is helpful, but it's actually that kind of graded exposure to an anxiety-provoking situation that is helpful. So I'm studying to be a psychologist next year in my master's program, but I've got a few friends who are a few years in, and they've had clients where if they have a fear of germs, they'll ask them to stick their hand in a toilet and then not wash it for a few minutes. And that's a really high-end rated exposure. It's pretty intense. So you wouldn't do that straight away. So anybody who has a phobia, we would not get you to do that straight away.
I'm doing that myself.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't either. I wouldn't either. But it's to show them that nothing bad happens.
The whole kind of face your fear, gross. Kind of go rock climbing if you're scared of heights.
Yeah, exactly. But with virtual reality, we could give people even more minor graded exposure and just start them off with a completely fictitious scenario and help them ease into it even more.
I had a good example with like an arachnophobe. They can start off with a really pixelated spider and then build up the detail and pixelation level of density until it looks realistic.
Yeah.
They can get really close to it.
Yeah. I think that'd be really good as well, because especially for people who are arachnophobic, actually having those spiders in therapy would be quite arduous for the professional to get in and keep those spiders.
Yeah, incredibly.
Yeah, we actually had a PhD student. She's got a poster up in the hallway, but she did spider phobia for her PhD, and she was looking at attentional biases to spiders and away from spiders. So
we're going to move into your research now. What have you found, and what are you you're looking at the cognitive psychology relation to insomnias and their behavioural and emotional relations.
Yeah.
Could you give us a little bit more details about that, and what have you found so far?
Yeah, sure. So my research, like all PhD research, it has evolved over the years as you try to define what on earth you're actually looking at. And in the end, I've conducted all my studies, and I'm just in the final phases of writing up my PhD thesis. What we ended up looking at was what people pay attention to unconsciously and how that affects their worry just before bed and how that also affects their sleep quality. So I guess to explain this, I need to explain what attentional bias is, which is the main process that I've looked at. So as humans, we take in thousands of pieces of information each day, but our brains do not have the capacity to attend to absolutely everything. One piece of information that the brain is particularly hardwired to pay attention to is negative information, and this phenomenon is called attentional bias to negativity. So that's what I'm looking at in my research. And the way we measure that is through really boring cognitive tasks. So I ask people to look at a screen, and two words will flash up on that screen, one that's negative and then one that is neutral, like the word chair, and the negative word might be fatigue. And I designed this word set with insomniacs to see what would be most negative to them and most personally relevant. So these two words will flash up on a screen. The split second later they'll disappear. Two dots will appear in place of the neutral word. And it will do so for several hundred trials. The idea is to snap the eyes away from the part of the screen that contains the negative word and to the neutral word, conditioning the brain to pay less attention to negativity. It sounds simple. It sounds kind of magic-y. When I started out, I was like, how good is this task? But in several meta-analyses, it's shown that this task reliably taps into the process that we want to, which is attentional bias to negativity. And it also is shown to retrain attention away from negativity. So it's really, I'd say, basic cognition that we look at in our lab, and this is how we do it. So we could fancify it. We've got some gamified tasks to make it more interesting to participants now. So where we have faces move around a screen and we get them to identify the negative face and the more neutral face and try to retrain them that way, which is definitely more fun. But I'd say mine is kind of the pilot task.
Yeah.
And I use that to look at attention to negativity. So in a few of my studies, I asked people what's their attentional bias during the day, and I got them to complete that task and then had a look at their sleep quality. But then I guess the best studies that I've done have been the ones at night. And we wanted to find out what they were paying attention to at night and how that affected their sleep. So I asked them to complete the attentional bias assessment task before they went to bed. And then they completed a questionnaire that assessed their worry. and then they fell asleep and they completed sleep diaries and they woke up. I also got them to wear an actigraph watch, which is a type of objective measurement of sleep. So I could compare their subjective sleep diaries to the objective measurement of their sleep. So it measures movement.
How many people did you have in the study, and how long was each period? Were you just like one sleep cycle, or were you going for a week period long?
Yeah, so it was 5 days. I used undergraduate students, so I didn't want them to be in on the weekends. I just wanted, I guess, a reliable period of their sleep, and that's Monday to Friday during the university semester.
Yeah.
So it was 5 days. I had 50 participants in one study, and we did find that they were recruited along a continuum, so they all didn't have insomnia. Some of them had good sleep, some of them had poor sleep. What we found was those with the poor sleep paid more attention to negativity compared to those with good sleep. So this was what we found during the daytime as well. So it seems that people with insomnia are unconsciously paying more attention to negativity, and particularly sleep-related negativity. So why can't I get to sleep? What's wrong with me if I can't sleep? If I don't get 8 hours of sleep tonight, then I'll be a mess tomorrow. Those kinds of thoughts.
So it's kind of looking into the whole glass half full scenario, and are you an optimist or a pessimist outlook on life? And
definitely.
People often say, I've heard it all before, where they kind of go like, oh, why does all the good things happen to them? Where they're focusing on the good aspects of someone else's life, but that you don't ever hear about their bad things, and they kind of take that on board. Yeah. And therefore they've become this pessimistic outlook on their life, and in this case related to their sleeping cycle.
Yeah. So I guess my research is trying to test the theoretical models that we have now. So we think that people with insomnia pay more attention to negativity and affects their sleep, but we don't actually know. So that's what gap my research is filling. And we're trying to take it a step further. So we found out that they do pay attention to negativity. In my next studies, I wanted to retrain that and see whether it could improve sleep. So I did that over 8 days. And it was a within subject study for my first study. So that meant that the same participants completed an attentional bias modification task on one night. And then on the next night, they completed a control task that didn't retrain their attention at all. So that continued for 8 days. So they completed the training, then a control task, a training, then a control task.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And so we wanted to see whether, compared to themselves, whether on the nights that they completed the training task, did they have better sleep compared to those nights when they completed the control task. And we found that on nights that they completed the training task, they reported less worry and less time taken to fall asleep, overall better sleep quality, compared to those nights when they completed the control task. So our within subject study is particularly good for psychologists because we reduce all that variance that would be the between groups using different participants. So this was a really, robust, reliable finding that we had, and we're really excited by it.
Did you find that as this, experimental period went on, and they were having their, test cycle control, on their controls later in the week, did you find that they had a better sleep outcome from the test cycles previously?
No.
No, okay.
So we don't think that, we couldn't tell from this study whether it was an enduring effect. Our objective with this study was to see whether an acute manipulation of attention can result in the next day or the next night improving sleep. So we wanted to see, what was the smallest dose that we could see improving sleep. So with a control night the next day, we would assume that would kind of wash away almost the training the previous night. So this wasn't an enduring kind of study that we're looking at. But in our next study, that's what we did look at. So what we did was a between group study, and we gave one group the training task for 5 days and the other group no training task for 5 days. They still completed a computer task, but it just wasn't training attention. And in this study, we got them to complete a sleep diary, and we also asked them to wear an instrument that measured their sleep that they actually wore around their foreheads, and it measured the frontalis muscle, which is on their forehead, and that was used to infer sleep quality.
Mm-hmm.
So what we found with this one was that there was an enduring effect. So their sleep actually did get better across the 5 days, and also compared to the control group. And this was also seen on the subjective, but also the objective measure of their sleep. So they found that they had less worry, they fell asleep faster, and they rated that they had overall better sleep improvement, and this was supported by the objective measurement.
It sounds like an awfully, it's amazing in itself, but a quite an easy fix, I suppose, to not knock it down too much for the research you're doing.
Yeah.
But if someone was to be suffering from poor sleep or like low to mild insomnia, I suppose.
That's what we've looked at.
Yeah. So if someone is suffering that, it almost sounds like if they were to just reflect on their day, write a sleep diary, or have maybe an activity pack you used to get as a child, but you use it before you go to bed. 5 minutes, and it just improves your sleep quality. It sounds like an amazing kind of treatment plan.
That's kind of what we are gearing up to do. So this treatment is called Attentional Bias Modification, but I would not recommend it as a treatment for anybody with a mental illness right now. Mm-hmm. It's still in the experimental phases, and there are some people online who will try and tell you to pay money for it, but I wouldn't recommend that you actually go there and do that. So our whole lab is an anxiety lab, and we look at attentional bias because we know that people paying attention to negativity actually contributes to anxiety, and most people who have sleep problems also have this anxiety. So I guess that's why I'm the sleep lady, and I'm kind of coming off of that research. And we know that cognitive biases underlie the majority, if not all, mental health problems. So with depression, we know that a main feature of the condition is memory bias, such that people with depression find it incredibly difficult to think of any positive memories, and they will more often bring up those negative, awful memories in the past, and they just simply cannot recall any positive ones. And you can point it out to them, but when you do that over time, it reduces their depressive symptomatology. Similar to people who have anxiety, when you point out those kind of realistic aspects of a situation that you won't screw up in a social situation, within only a few sessions, we know that that reduces people's anxiety symptomatology. So in our lab, we're trying to get at the basic mechanisms for why that happens and how we can almost speed that up and do it faster. We're trying to develop better treatments because we know for not everybody who experiences anxiety or depression or any other mental illness, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Of course.
So we want to be able to develop better, more effective treatments for everyone. And we do that by breaking it down into its most basic components.
It takes away the old wives' tale of if you're anxious or got anxiety about public speaking, don't imagine everyone naked. That doesn't sound like it's going to do any wonders for you anymore. It sounds like it might just exacerbate the symptoms.
Yeah, I think I would actually. Yeah. I have tried it before, and I can assure you it didn't work for me. It didn't work.
I've tried it before as well. I was just like, see how this goes.
Yeah.
And the thing I fumbled more. I was just like,
me too.
Why are you naked? Come on.
Yeah, and I was just like, I feel a bit grossed out. Yeah.
There's that part as well. Where they're kind of like, now I just feel dirty.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you start thinking about that.
Yeah.
So with limitations to your study, have there been any significant limitations, or has it been a smooth going project so far?
Well, overall, I'm really happy with how the experiments turned out. I got some really great data, and I got a lot of results that are really usable for my PhD. I guess the main limitations are sleep itself is very variable, and the time spans that we looked at sleep can give an indication of, a person's sleep, but there's a number of things that could have been going on in these people's lives. Even if I held the experiments too close to exams, that could have been a confounding factor in whether my experimental manipulation had actually improved their sleep, or whether it was limited because they were just overwhelmingly worrying about exams or other things in their life. So sleep in itself is difficult to measure and study. Even when you get people in the lab for an objective measurement and you hook them up to polysomnography, so that's the PSG objective measure, there's something that's called a first night effect. So people will be so startled, I guess, by their new environment that you won't get perhaps as good a reading as you would the next night.
Yeah.
In my studies, I did have a few baseline days, but it's difficult to tell whether that was enough of a baseline to reduce that kind of variability and anxiousness perhaps that they had about their sleep actually being measured. Another confounding factor, which I picked up later in my research, but also just the fact that I was asking them to complete a computer task before bed. We were just talking about the impact of technology on sleep, and it was only for 10-15 minutes that they were completing these tasks before bed, but it could have had an impact on their normal sleep routine, and it might have affected what perhaps they listened to music for an hour before bed, and then I asked them to complete a computer task and I ruined that for them, so they found it more difficult to fall asleep. So I guess those are the major ones, but I think overall the thesis really highlighted what's going on in the minds of people with mild to moderate insomnia just before bed, and how that affects their emotions, and how we can possibly retrain their cognitions, the harmful ones, to actually improve their sleep. So I'm really proud of the research that we did conduct, and it's really set up a really solid foundation for any future researchers to take it further.
Yeah, it sounds really fascinating. Yeah. It sounds, like you said, a really solid foundation for progression in this field.
Yeah.
And that's the end of our show today. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. As I said before, that was the first installment of our discussion with Bronwyn. If you would like to check out the second one, it will be released later this week, and we'll be discussing a lot more about mental health and her story and experiences. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and as always, check out www.vaguelyaccurate.com, and also check out Ace Podcast Network. They're a great bunch of guys, and there's a lot of shows, so see if you can find something that's your cup of tea. Take care.